Yes.
The House Education and Workforce Committee will come to order. Would the clerk please call the roll?
Chair DeBoer. Here. Representative Linting.
Representative.
Rep. Linting. Here. Sorry. Head.
Here.
Fox. Coons.
Here.
St. Germain. Here. Pablo.
Here.
Wilson.
Here.
Colzar.
Here.
Weiss. Here. Burns. Here. Madam Chair, you have 10 members present. You do have a quorum.
Thank you. Vice Chair Linting moves to adopt the minutes of the December 10th meeting. Without objection, the minutes are adopted. Thank you, Madam Clerk. The committee will begin today by taking further testimony on House Bill 5044, sponsored by Representative Wendzel. First, we are joined by Michelle Eddy, an attorney with the Thrun Law Firm here in Michigan. I understand her practice focused primarily on special education, student issues, Title IX, and general school law matters. She is testifying in opposition. Please make your way to the table. We're happy to hear.
Thank you, Chairwoman DeBoer. Appreciate the opportunity to speak to this committee in opposition to House Bill 5044. My name is Michelle Eddy, and I'm an attorney with the Thrun Law Firm, and I am here on behalf of the over 1,000 members of the Michigan Association of Administrators for Special Education, or MACE. That includes special education administrators from local intermediate school districts as well as public school academies. As a way of background, the Thrun Law Firm is a education law firm. We have represented school districts in this state for over 75 years. We represent over 525 school districts here in the state of Michigan, and so our practice takes us throughout the state, including the UP. And so for me, and for the last 30 years of my legal practice, I have focused specifically on special education issues, as well as some other general school law matters, and it's with that lens that I come to speak with you today. As you know, a number of students with autism and other disabilities have been receiving outside ABA services or other therapies or medically necessary therapies, and there's been an increase of that over the years. And we have seen schools really struggle with how to properly address requests and demands from outside providers for things such as giving them space in the building during the school day to work with the student, or to have the provider accompany the student throughout the school day, even though maybe that student already has a paraprofessional. While school officials value and recognize the importance of collaborating with these outside partners, they are struggling to balance the important role that they serve in educating students with the efforts and the responsibilities of those outside providers. I think it's important to note that school districts have legal obligations to our students with disabilities under both federal and state law. Specifically, they have an obligation to provide those students educational programs and services at no cost to their parents or guardians that will allow the student to receive meaningful educational benefit while they're in school, or what we refer to as FAPE, a free appropriate public education. That is what the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act requires of schools, to provide all eligible students with a disability as that term is defined under the IDA, of free appropriate public education. And part of providing a free appropriate public education requires that we ensure maximum access to the school district's general curriculum and providing curriculum and programming that offers our students with disabilities an opportunity to earn a regular high school diploma consistent with the Michigan Merit Curriculum. Additionally, schools have an obligation to educate those students in the least restrictive environment to the extent appropriate for the student, which means time with their non-disabled peers is essential and required in students' IEPs for those who can participate in general education offerings. So it's with those obligations that schools struggle with House Bill 5044. Unfortunately, the bill interferes with the school's ability to comply with these key laws and important mandates, and could result in students not receiving all of their required IEP services, having access to non-disabled peers, or the required access to the general ed curriculum, as schools attempt to try to juggle coordinating these outside services with mandated educational services provided for under the IDEA and other laws. Some key points to consider. ABA therapy has been consistently defined in case law as either special education or a related service by the courts. IEP teams, that's going to be the team that knows the student best, who designs that student's educational plan. They are legally required to determine if or when and under what circumstances a student requires ABA services in order to receive a free appropriate public education. So IEP teams should already be looking at whether or not ABA services are educationally necessary for providing that student a free appropriate public education. And in fact, many schools do indeed incorporate ABA therapy into students' IEP goals or in terms of related services or supplemental aids and supports. It's already in many students' IEPs. Additionally, the U.S. Department of Education Office of Special Education Programs, as well as state and federal courts, have concluded that there is no per se entitlement to ABA services during the school day or even on school property, even if those services have been determined medically necessary by a student's physician or other health provider. Instead, schools are required to ensure that their decisions regarding the student's needs, okay, and that the student's IEP reflects the student's unique needs. And if that means that a student can only receive meaningful educational benefit from their education through ABA services, the school is required to provide those services themselves as part of providing the student a free appropriate public education. It's been argued by proponents of this bill that ABA services or medically necessary treatment in the schools is required under the Americans with Disabilities Act and Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act as a required accommodation. That position is not supported by the text of Section 504 or the ADA or the case law interpreting those statutes. As most of you are aware, the primary purpose of the ADA and Section 504, two federal disability discrimination statutes, is to provide individuals with disabilities equal access to an entity's programs, activities, and services. Part of that process is to engage in an interactive process with the individual with a disability to determine what accommodations may be needed. It's not an automatic. And so therefore, that is the falsehood in that argument. There isn't an automatic entitlement to ABA services in the school as a reasonable accommodation. Reasonable accommodations are determined on an individual review of a particular individual with disabilities circumstances, what their needs are, and taking a look at whether or not the accommodation results in an undue burden or a fundamental alteration of the school's programs and services. Now, proponents have said that ABA services would essentially, in the school, would help maximize the student's potential and allow them to grow and be successful in all settings. But that goal is a far cry from equal access required under Section 504 in the ADA. Equal access is not the same as maximizing an individual's potential. And that's the crux of both Section 504 and the ADA. Finally, I want to note that I believe there was some questions from the committee about how insurance might play a factor in here. And I'll be the first to say I'm not a Medicaid or insurance guru, okay? That's not my thing. But I do think it's important to note a 1999 case here in Michigan that involved a Michigan public school. They had a young man who was involved in a very tragic bike car accident and became severely disabled because of that. And as a result of that accident, the student required round-the-clock nursing services, which his insurance company paid for. When the student was well enough to return to school, the nursing services continued because he required that level of care. Fast forward a few years later, the insurance company sued the school district, seeking a declaratory ruling as well as reimbursement for the funds that they had expended in providing nursing services to the student during the school day. Because the insurance company's argument was that these medically necessary services were needed during the educational day, and therefore, the school district was required to provide that as a component of a free, appropriate public education. So the insurance company essentially made a subrogation, advanced the subrogation theory, and they prevailed. And the school district was required to reimburse the insurance company for those services during the school day. So I think that case alone causes me a bit of a pause about this bill and how insurance companies may approach this if services are being provided in the school day, during the school day in the school. And how do you essentially balance that with who's responsible? Because once you say that we need to provide those services during the school day, does that indeed become the school district's responsibility under their obligation in the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act? So what's the answer for all of this? I will tell you, I think it is the guidance, the recently issued guidance from the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services and the Michigan Department of Education. This is the first time that schools have received some guidance on these issues. And clients that I've talked to, schools that I have talked to, were excited to learn that there was some guidance there to help them navigate these tough questions that they are dealing and trying to balance these issues and the requests from parents and outside providers to provide services within the school setting. I think the most important part of this guidance is the fact that it clearly reminds school officials that they must first consider whether or not they, as a school, under their obligations under the IDA, must provide these services to the student in order for the student to receive meaningful educational benefit from their IEPs. And what I like about the guidance is that it also goes further. I mean, it gives a good first step, but it also talks about considerations such as liability and other concerns, which schools rightfully have when you're talking about outside individuals coming into the school, working with students, being around other students, and largely not being supervised by anybody in the school. There are certainly liability concerns, and this guidance talks about those considerations and helps schools, giving them a framework to help guide some of the decision-making in this regard. I know you are going to be hearing from the Michigan Department of Education next about this guidance, but I was excited to see this issued in May. And when I have shared it with my school clients, they've been excited to see it, and they're like, thank you, some guidance. Because they want to do what's right. Schools want to do what's right, but they also want to ensure that the students receive all of their IEP required services, that they get true access to the general ed curriculum, and that they get to maximize those opportunities with their non-disabled peers. And the question is, how do we do all of that in a school day when we are also looking at mandating outside services in the school setting? Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Any questions? Representative Coons.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Counselor, I apologize. I try and ask very direct questions, so in advance, I apologize. The guidelines are not binding. Wouldn't it be better to put this in statute? I don't know, obviously, we're all here, we're trying to do the right thing. So again, forgive my vagueness on the question, but the guidelines are not binding. So when we get people in, they say, well, that's just a guideline. We don't need to do that. So here's where I'm struggling is, wouldn't it be better to quantify this?
I think that's a great question, and you're right. We are always very quick to say, well, that's guidance, that's not the law, so we don't have to follow it. But guidance is important because this is guidance from an administrative agency, and courts will give deference to that guidance in court cases, even though it's not, quote, binding law. They look to the administrative agencies as being experts in this area, so they will give deference to that guidance. Two, I think it is important with this guidance just being rolled out to kind of see whether or not it has the desired effect before perhaps taking those next steps of going the route of
When did the guidance come out? May.
in May,
Okay.
yes.
And Madam Chair, if I may follow up with a question? You had referenced some conflicts that this proposed legislation, 5044, conflicts with federal law. Could you expand on that? Did I misunderstand that?
Well, school districts have a obligation to ensure that students with disabilities receive a free, appropriate public education. I won't use acronyms, FAPE. And part of that is providing students programs and services that are going to allow the student to access the general ed curriculum and to provide them a meaningful educational benefit. And so that, for some students, could involve some specially designed instruction or special ed with a special teacher during certain times of the school day. They may be pulled out to be working with a speech therapist or an occupational therapist during the school day. So all of those things are legally required by the student's IEP. Failure to provide those services can result in liability to the school for failing, or what we refer to as a denial of fate for the student. So that is one thing. Compliance, the IEP is essentially a written contract. It's a commitment by the district that they're going to ensure to provide those services. Additionally, schools are required to measure the student's progress towards those goals. And if the student isn't making progress for whatever reason, including that they're not having enough time to receive those services because they're being pulled out or directed to outside ABA services, then districts are required to review and revise that IEP to try to ensure that the student is able to make progress to goals and objectives. So the concern is that the provision of outside services during the school day may interrupt the regular programming and services that students are required to receive, not only under their IEP, but a lot of the students are also in general ed classes for reading, writing, math, social studies, science. At when do you look to pull a student, if that's what is being proposed, out of, what class? If we look to say, hey, we'll pull a student out of recess or a special or elective class, those times are oftentimes the only time that a student might have opportunities to be interacting with their non-disabled peers. So they won't be able to take advantage of those inclusion opportunities. So that's the concern.
Thank you.
Thank you, Counselor. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Representative Weiss.
Thank you. Thank you for your testimony today. I did want to follow up on a concern that you brought up around insurance. And it has been something that we haven't really discussed that much in committee around this issue. As written, as the bill is currently written, is there any clarity in terms of who would be responsible for paying for these ABA services if they were offered during the school day? And also, could there be additional concerns around liability, perhaps, as well? And is there anything in the bill to address either of those issues, and could there potentially be?
Okay. Ooh,
Sorry, that was a lot of question in one question.
So, in terms of insurance, my read of the bill is that issue is not currently addressed. So that, again, sort of raises concerns for me. Liability is also not specifically addressed in the bill. I guess perhaps it is contemplated that that could be part of policy that is required by the bill, but that is certainly a concern, and I will be blunt, that is, as a lawyer, when I'm talking with clients and they are talking about the risk of having an outside ABIA or any other service provider in, that's one of the primary issues that I do discuss with my clients. Because again, these individuals, they're not employees of the district. We would not know if there have been background checks, fingerprinting done. They're not employees, so they're not subject to the revised school code requirements that there be a comprehensive background check. If they're working individually with a student, who's providing supervision and oversight? That person is not a school employee, so that's not the principal, it's not the teacher. And so even those small issues like that cause me concern and certainly make me pause when we talk about having anyone outside coming in. And I'm not sure that simply doing a quick background check or filling out sort of a volunteer form would satisfy those potential liability concerns. And that is not addressed in the bill as currently written.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions? No? Oh, yes, Representative Paquette.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So to kind of back to Representative Kuntz's points, do you suspect then, like, with the guidelines being implemented, that this will remedy some of the problems of facilitating outside services coming in and then wait and see?
That would be my hope.
What timeline would you say would be a good time then to return to this down the road?
That's a very good question. And I think right now, it was rolled out in May, but quite frankly, I have to laugh. One of my clients brought it to my attention. So there wasn't a lot of fanfare to it. I mean, I usually kind of try to stay abreast of things, and the client said, well, I've gotten this, and I said, what are you talking about? And so I first learned of that guidance probably in June of this year. So I don't think that there's been an adequate rollout of the guidance. My understanding is that is going to occur, and I'm going to defer to MDE to kind of talk about that.
Why wasn't it adequate? The rollout. Why wasn't it adequate?
From the standpoint, I'm not sure that every school district or public school academy in the state is aware that that guidance is out there. I know that certainly my office has, we do newsletters and things of that nature, and we're trying to get that information out to our clients, but I'm not sure it's been publicly disseminated. Maybe it did occur in May, but I'm still talking to schools that were not aware that that guidance was out there. So that's why I'm saying I think there needs to be either a bigger rollout or some other type of announcement to make sure that people are aware that it is out there.
Gotcha. And so kind of back to that timeline question is, when do you think would be an appropriate time to return to this to be like, were the guidelines effective or not?
I would say that I think it would make sense to at least, once there's been an appropriate rollout or announcement of that, maybe revisiting this anywhere from a year and a half down the road to get feedback on whether or not we're seeing any changes.
Okay. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you so much. We appreciate you coming in.
Thank you very much again for having me here.
Thank you. So in continuing with the testimony on House Bill 5044, we have testimony from the Michigan Department of Education on the guidelines for the provision of the Applied Behavior Analysis, ABA, in public schools. This recent document was mentioned during previous testimony, but not in any detail. So please introduce yourselves and begin when you are ready.
Good morning, members of, can everyone hear me okay? All right. My name is Olivia Ponte, and I am the legislative liaison for the Michigan Department of Education. So thank you so much for the invitation to come in and talk about the guidelines for the provision of ABA in schools this morning. Yeah, like you said, there were a few questions from some of the previous committee hearings about what's in the guidelines, when did they come out. As was just discussed, they're pretty hot off the presses. So I have Rebecca and Amy here with me to discuss what is in the guidelines. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to them.
All right. Thank you, Madam Chair, for allowing us the opportunity to come in, and the rest of the committee as well. I am Rebecca McIntyre. I'm the Assistant Director in the Office of Special Education at Michigan Department of Education. I bring with me experience as a special education teacher in a local school district and special education administration at an intermediate school district before joining the team at Michigan Department of Education. As well, I served on the Michigan Autism Council while I was both at the Intermediate School District and Michigan Department of Education when I moved here. So bring that lens as well.
Good morning, everyone. I am Amy Matthews, and I'm going to kind of talk about a few different hats that I wear. I am faculty at Grand Valley State University in the psychology department, have been there for about 27 years, and I am also the director of the statewide Autism Resources and Training Project, START, funded by the Michigan Department of Ed Office of Special Education, and I'm the chair of the Autism Council, but I am not here representing the Autism Council today. I'm a licensed psychologist, board-certified behavior analyst, but I've been working in public schools for the past 25 years and worked in private programs before that.
Okay, so before we get started, we're here today to provide you some information about the guidelines for the provision of applied behavior analysis, ABA, in schools. So Amy's going to provide you with some historical perspective, and I'm going to talk about the development of those guidelines before we get into the meat of the guidelines. So, but I do want to start by saying that these guidelines center on the obligation of school districts that they have and the roles and responsibilities of the private providers, the ABA providers, and the behavior analysts, and how those can be provided in school. Okay, so we're going to walk through these. We are going to be using acronyms, so I like to set the stage here because it will speed this up just a little bit. So we will be talking about autism spectrum disorder, so ASD, free appropriate public education will be FAPE, LRE, least restrictive environment, the IDEA, Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. So these are things that you're going to see school districts having an obligation for. So IEP, Individualized Education Program. We'll also have IEP teams that we'll talk about. We'll also talk about multi-tiered systems of supports and positive behavior interventions and supports. Those are provided within school districts as well. Then we'll also talk about ABA and what is it, okay, and board-certified behavior analysts and assistant behavior analysts and registered behavior technicians. Those are the roles that we are seeing within schools to provide ABA services. Okay.
All right, so I'm going to provide just a little bit of historical perspective, like how did we get to this place where we would even need these guidelines? So I had mentioned I've been doing this for a long time. I've been working in the field of autism, behavior analysis, education for about 35 years. So I saw where we were in the past and kind of where we are now. And despite the fact that there are some tensions, I think we're in a much better place as far as offering services to students. But we know a lot of autistic students need more intensive services in order to meet their needs in the areas of communication, social interaction, learning, regulation, adaptive care skills. And we want them to be able to be successful across environments, school, home, and community. Historically, services were primarily provided to students in the school environment. That's where I was, early on. So the reason I worked in private schools early on is there just weren't a lot of ABA services in any other settings. There wasn't insurance-based services. Insurance did not reimburse for applied behavior analysis for individuals with autism. So in 2012, legislation was passed in Michigan so that ABA services would be covered under both public and private insurance. And that was happening across the country. So for the first time, ABA would be a covered service. Before that, families paid out of pocket for ABA services. And board-certified behavior analysts are the folks who provide those insurance-based services. So why is this important? Well, this becomes important because now we have schools providing services to students as they have for as long as students with disabilities have been given services within schools. But we also have board-certified behavior analysts providing ABA services in a clinical setting. So we suddenly need opportunities for them to be able to coordinate and collaborate around those services. So this is fairly new. Within the past 13 years, we've really had to kind of look at coordinating these services in a way that we didn't have to in the past. So the Michigan guidelines were our effort to look at how we can create these opportunities for better collaboration and coordination between schools and providers, because we were hearing that there were some tensions around coordinating these services. So I know one of the questions was like, how long will this take in order to see some kind of outcome? And what we know from research is 3 to 5 years for like complete systems change. I think it should be monitored every year to see if we're making progress, but I don't anticipate that full changes are going to happen immediately. So I think the guidelines do need a little bit of time, an intentional effort to see some real progress.
Okay, so in 2019, and this was when I was serving on the Autism Council as well, the Medicaid expansion, the Caring for Students expansion applied to all students, general education and special education, and it included a very specific opportunity for reimbursements for BCBAs and BCABAs in schools. And so really the intent of that was to allow for BCBAs and BCABAs to work in the schools supporting multi-tiered systems of supports through PBIS, through any behavioral supports, whether it be whole school, classroom, individual students, but working to support behaviors. It wasn't until 2022, there was a recommendation through the Autism Council, because there were conversations going on about legislation and introducing legislation that would require, I believe the legislation was similar to the state of Colorado's, and bringing that here into Michigan. And for many reasons, that was not going to be able to be implemented with fidelity. And so we started talking about guidelines and how could guidelines support this integration of these two entities, I'm going to call them, because really it is two perspectives, right? So schools do not understand the obligations, the experiences, the language that BCBA's clinical providers have, and clinical providers don't understand that of the school districts in the same. So how can guidelines support that? So in 2024, MDE and the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services, we developed a subcommittee that was made up of a diverse set of stakeholders. We had, and these acronyms I did not include on the slide, but the prepaid inpatient, health programs, thank you. Community mental health, we had providers from pediatrics, medical pediatrics. We had local school districts and intermediate school districts. We had BCBAs. I think we had 6 BCBAs on there. We had Michigan Department of Health and Human Services, Medicaid, Michigan Department of Education. We had a very diverse set of stakeholders so that we could really truly understand what the barriers to implementation and integrating the two would be.
Jumping back, we wanted to clarify, like, what do we mean by ABA services? Because I think that's something that sometimes gets a little bit confused. So just to kind of level set and clarify, applied behavior analysis is actually a scientific discipline. It's the science of learning and behavior. And it really is applied to all situations and all behavior. So we're talking about ABA as it applies to autism, but actually applied behavior analysis can be used really with all human behavior, because it's about kind of learning, understanding behavior and behavior change. So the goal is to really understand how the environment plays a role in behavior and what skills might be needed to be successful across environments. So if you look at the second bullet, and think about the goal, you can think about how this is really important in a school environment, right? We're looking at school buildings, classrooms, students, and how we can influence the environment and teach skills for students to be successful, and how teachers can be successful in teaching students. So really, applied behavior analysis is a science that can be applied in many different settings and ways. I think what we're talking about here is how a board-certified behavior analysts are credentialed and licensed to deliver ABA services as part of an insurance-based medically necessary service. So one of the things we want to do is kind of help you understand that BCBAs provide a service that's medically necessary as part of insurance, but ABA principles and practices that come out of the science can be utilized by school-based staff across the school day, across settings with students, including students with autism. So like I said, they're used across the school day. If you're familiar with school-wide positive behavior interventions and supports, that has a foundation in applied behavior analysis. Through our START project, our state autism project, we do professional learning, coaching, develop resources, and coordinate with schools across the state. We have 3 BCBAs as part of our START team. So behavior analysis is part of what we talk about when we're training teachers across the state. So it can be infused within the school environment and the work that we do with students, all students, not just students with autism. We know for some students, including students with autism, they might require more intensive services, and that would involve more hours, more intentional teaching, more progress monitoring to achieve their individual goals. And that's where an IEP team would look at whether a student might benefit from ABA services within the school environment. But just to be clear, ABA is being used, the science of ABA is being used across the school day, across classrooms, just in general. So I think what we're talking about here is that very specific service. But for us, like I always think about for our students, whether they have a disability, where they have autism, we want them to be learning in their natural environment. The natural environment for children is the school environment, and we want them to be able to learn skills with their peers. And even if they're working in an ABA clinic with an ABA provider, which is very beneficial for them to learn all kinds of skills, we want them to be able to generalize those skills to typical settings like homeschool and community. This is why we need to collaborate. So ABA practices are being used in school. Board-certified behavior analysts are offering ABA services within clinic and home settings. How do we work together to coordinate goals so that we're really thinking about the best interests of the student and the family so that they get their needs met?
Do you want to talk about basketball? No?
Yeah, I could talk about basketball. One of the ways I think about and the reason why it's so important for students to be in school and learning in the school context and be able to use those skills in schools. And ABA services are really beneficial for students to learn very specific skills, communication skills, learning to learn skills, following instruction, adaptive skills, and they might be learning that as part of their insurance-based services. But learning skills outside of a context is not going to be ultimately helpful for them in the community. So I think about basketball. So if somebody says, I really want to become a really, really good basketball player, and I'm going to hire a coach to do one-on-one teaching with me, and I'm going to learn how to free throw, I'm going to become really fast on the court, and I'm going to learn how to dribble really well. And they develop those skills, and they're fantastic at those skills. Now you drop them into a basketball game. It's a completely different kind of experience. You have 9 other people on the court, you have people blocking you when you're shooting, you have to dribble around people. It's completely different. And I feel like that's where we are with our students sometimes. They learn a bunch of skills, maybe one-on-one in a separate setting, and now they're in the school environment and they have to learn how to navigate a classroom and learning in groups and being with peers. So we really want students to be able to learn in their natural environment with really good teaching and really good intentionality, using the practices of ABA, but delivered in a school environment. And so that's kind of what we're thinking is like, we really want that collaboration between ABA services that are teaching those individual skills and the school environment, which is the natural context for students to use those skills.
Okay, so now for the guidelines. So again, I just want to remind you that these guidelines were developed because we have two different disciplines that do not understand each other's obligations and language, experiences, and knowledge. And ultimately, the improving outcomes for a student is what these two disciplines have in common, and the same student. And so really helping them understand each other's work and how that work can be integrated is the purpose of these guidelines. It's not, the guidelines weren't developed for the consumers themselves to say, how can we take advantage of these two? So that is something that would be supplemental to this, but these are to get the two parties working together. So I want to start off with saying that qualifying for autism insurance benefit with a medical diagnosis it's not the same as qualifying as a student with autism in an educational setting. So that's one important distinction to make. An ABA therapy requires that medical diagnosis. And so sometimes you'll have students with autism in a school who may not have educational criteria as a student with a disability. Okay, and those students you might see under a 504 plan, or they may not have any type of a plan. And we'll talk about that more. So the medical diagnosis of autism does not automatically mean that there'll be a student with a disability or student with autism under the IDEA. Eligibility as a student with autism, according to Michigan guidelines, Michigan rules for special education, and the federal IDEA, entitles a student then to a FAPE in the LRE. So FAPE is going to be the special education and services that come at no cost to the parent, and they are appropriate to the needs of the student. Okay, and FAPE includes specially designed instruction by qualified personnel for a full school day. Okay, so those things are very clear in the IDEA. Least restrictive environment is where they would be educated if they did not have a disability. So those are the two main concepts of the IDEA that school districts need to keep in mind. Okay. All right, so to talk about ABA across settings, again, Amy laid the groundwork on this. So BCBAs, they are those clinical providers, and they are providing ABA most typically in a one-on-one or very small group setting. Most people understand that and know that as a discrete trial training. It is one-on-one. There is difficulty with generalizing to other settings, but that is usually in a clinical setting how ABA is delivered. It's important to note, I'd like to point out that BCBAs are nationally certified and they are Michigan licensed to be able to provide ABA, those clinical services. So in school settings, we have, like Amy was saying, we have teachers, educators, paraprofessionals, social workers. We do have BCBAs and the behavior technicians. They are providing or utilizing principles of ABA in schools on a daily basis throughout the day. So, and they're doing that to ensure that all students, and sometimes very individual students if it's through an IEP, but they have access to the general education classroom and make progress in the general ed curriculum. That's that educational benefit piece that Michelle was talking about. So we see in school settings that ABA, the principles of ABA are generally utilized in a school-wide or classroom positive behavior intervention supports. And you may be familiar with some of these. You might see a high level of visual supports around the building or in a classroom for a student to utilize. Some modeling and reinforcement are principles of ABA. When you start to get into some Tier 2 or Tier 3, we're going to be looking at some functional behavior assessments, which will require some observations and analyzing the antecedents and what potentially is causing the behaviors to occur, and how we're responding to those behaviors. So those are also principles of ABA, and development of behavior plans. And then there's also direct services that are provided, behavioral supports, to individual students that we may see through an IEP. Also, what I wanted to say, the school-based staff, they are, whereas your BCBAs are nationally certified and Michigan licensed, you're looking at your educators have their teaching certificates. They have ongoing professional learning requirements. The START, Statewide Autism Resources and Training, is one of the ways that there is continuous ongoing learning as far as principles of ABA and how to support students with autism are being provided to educators. I know the Michigan Association of Administrators of Special Education also have some trainings for paraprofessionals, their parapro boot camps, and they have ABA in schools community of practice. So that's a great support as well. And then the Michigan Association of Intermediate Superintendents and the Special Education Instructional Learning Network, thank you, they provide some creating safe learning environments opportunities. So there's opportunities for people to learn how to support students with autism in the school setting as well. All right, dual entitlements. So we talked about that federal IDEA 504, though that's an entitlement. When a student meets educational criteria, they are entitled to that free appropriate public education, okay? So that's the federal law. In Michigan, we have our state law about the autism insurance benefit that entitles students who have the medically necessary treatment option in there, that they receive ABA as well. So you have a dual entitlement, and what we're trying to say is one should not come at the cost of the other. And what's happening right now in practice is parents are pulling students out of school. They are receiving ABA, I believe it's a minimum of 10 hours a week, some up to 40 hours a week. And so how do we collaborate those, integrate those two things together so that, because every day that a student is out of school, every hour, gaps in learning are growing and opportunities with their peers are being minimized. So we really need to focus on having ABA supplement education and not replace it, because we're on the replacement model right now, and that's not working great. And so to get that, we need greater collaboration between schools, private providers, and families. Can't forget the families. And so we do need to have that, because ultimately what we're going to see is greater engagement for the student and increased attendance, which ultimately then will improve their outcomes.
Thank you. That is the totality of your presentation. Okay, great. I have a few questions. So whichever of you would feel like you would like to answer it. The ABA may be provided in a variety of settings for a variety of purposes, right?
Yes.
Okay. And you say that the guidelines meet all children's needs and that the bill is not necessary. We have heard that. But I see that the guidelines state throughout that the district is not required to provide ABA unless it is required for a free and appropriate education. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. So whether something is medically necessary in a school setting is different than whether it is necessary for free and appropriate public education,
Yes.
right? Okay. So the Departments of Education of South Carolina, Colorado, and Minnesota have issued guidance stating that schools must consider disabled students' ADA requests for reasonable access to their private ABA providers to receive medically necessary care in the school setting, and that these are separate and additional rights from the IDEA and not limited to what IEP teams or other school officials think is necessary for free and appropriate public education. Do you disagree with that?
The ADA also has a free and appropriate public education requirement, so that would, our office, the Office of Special Education, does not work with the Section 504 and ADA, but there is a FAPE requirement.
Okay, so you don't agree with how they're doing it? Are you good with that, the other states' policies?
I would say every state is a little bit different, and I think, you talk about other states that have their legislation regarding this, and I think the state that we feel most aligned with is Virginia. So in Virginia, their state law required their Department of Health and Human Services and their Department of Education to work to create guidelines, and that's why the team here kind of saw that legislation and said, let's get ahead of that, because that's working really well in Virginia. So I don't know exactly. I haven't seen what you're talking about regarding Colorado and I think South Dakota. But I would say, just generally speaking, when doing research across other states, we feel most supportive of the approach taken in Virginia.
Okay. So the guidance document states that when the IEP team determines that certain ABA services are not necessary for a free and appropriate public education, the parent may pursue ABA provided by private therapists that is not part of an IEP. But it appears to prohibit this in the school setting. Is that correct in the guidance document?
I believe the guidance goes on to say that the parent can request and that the district has the discretion of who they can allow in. And so that would rely, since Michigan is a local control state, that would rely on development of some visitor policies and, working with their legal counsel to say what is allowable, what's the liabilities, and have something in place that way.
So would that be why then parents have to pursue legal action in order to have their therapist with their child?
I would say also, and maybe Rebecca can talk more intelligently about this than I can, but in the guidance document, there's also a section, in the development of an IEP, obviously it's parents, it's the school officials as well. And then if there is a disagreement, if the school is saying, I don't think that is necessary for educational benefit, but the parent really feels strongly, you can go on to a third-party review. Is that correct?
Yes, there are due process rights that they could file a complaint or file due process complaint. There's mediation options to bring the two parties together to talk about those to make sure that everything is being considered at no cost to the parents.
Okay. So while access to the school setting for private ABA therapists to deliver medically necessary care appears to be disallowed or not addressed by the guidance does allow this for the non-disabled students. Is that kind of discriminatory?
Well, can you repeat that again?
While access to the school setting for private ABA therapists to deliver medically necessary care appears to be disallowed or not addressed by the guidance does allow this for non-disabled students. So if a parent of a non-disabled student would like to have a therapist for their child, they can appeal to the school and they will accommodate that.
Yes, that goes back to that visitor policy, so the district is going to consider. And the same thing for a student with an IEP. If it is determined that a student needs ABA therapy, then the school district, the IEP team would determine that as a needed related service to support the student. And then the district would determine from there who's providing that. Right, so the IEP team doesn't say, yes, you can have your private provider. That's going to be on the district, so.
Whether it's,
I'll just add too, I think the slide up here, we didn't get to talk about, but, you know, the revised school code provides the attendance, compulsory attendance for all children, whether they are non-disabled or a student with a disability. And that 1,098 hours applies across the board. So whether you are taking a child out of class who has a disability or whether you are taking out a non-disabled student, that student is still missing out on critical educational attainment and contributing to chronic absenteeism in the state.
okay, the guidance document contemplates that non-disabled students can request access for their private ABA, access to deliver therapy in the school setting. So the disabled students with autism should have that same right.
Yes, they do. A parent just has to make a request to case manager or somebody, and anytime a parent makes a request, they can request the IEP team come together to talk about that, but it's the IEP team that determines that. I think that's what we're trying to say in there. But a parent can make that request at any time, and then the district just provides notice or holds the IEP team meeting.
So the guidance document says that when a non-disabled child asks for access to his or her ABA therapist, the school is to discuss with the parent and may, quote, enter into a contract memorandum of understanding, an MOU, or a memorandum of agreement that outlines the arrangement for the delivery of on-site therapy, including the consideration of FERPA and HIPAA requirements. And in this situation, the school, parents, and the provider should coordinate to address the variety of supports and therapy the student may receive, guided by any school or district policy governing logistical considerations. So, do you oppose having a similar process for children with disabilities, which is what the bill does here?
Yes, because that opportunity is already there, but it's through an IEP team. That's where the difference is.
Okay. So this guidance document, though, is not binding on school districts, correct? It's just guidance.
Correct.
And this guidance does not address how to handle requests under the ADA when a disabled child requests accommodation for his private ABA provider to provide prescribed ABA treatment in the school setting to address his autism impairments.
If that's in there.
That's all under the IEP, you said.
No, it's for 504 is in there as well.
Okay. So as a practical matter, schools do not themselves provide all the care that is medically necessary in this setting to treat a child's autism situation.
I mean, I think the role in the school environment is to address the students' educational needs, but there is clear crossover between what would be considered medically necessary and educational, which I think this is what is complicating this. So if I give you an example, a student with autism most often has difficulties with communication. That's going to affect them in the school environment, the home environment, the community environment. So where does that live? Does that live with the ABA provider or with the school? That's going to live in both places, right? Same thing is going to be true for some of the social challenges people with autism have. So I think it becomes a little bit difficult to say what is the medically necessary part of autism treatment and what is educationally important for students with autism. I think this is a complicated issue, which is why we're having this conversation. So I believe in the school environment, having worked with schools across Michigan for many, many years. I think schools are not perfect, but I think they're doing a pretty good job of addressing many of the challenges that students with autism are having that also impact them in the home and the community, whether it's communication, social learning, regulation, adaptive skills, and so on. So I think they don't provide medically necessary treatment in schools. That's not the purview of schools. But are they addressing similar kinds of needs? I would say yes, they absolutely are. And if it would be okay, I'd like to come back to what you had asked earlier. I talked to my colleague in Virginia yesterday, and she helped write the guidelines for Virginia. And actually, many of the other states use the Virginia guidelines to develop a lot of their guidelines. So they have been kind of used as the model. So they've worked really hard to support the guidelines and not move into a place where there is more restrictive legislation about what schools have to do, because the goal is collaboration and working together. And I can say in Michigan, but in other states, there is a lot of tension between the private providers and schools. It's not always been a productive relationship. We don't really want to go there. We really want to look at how do we work well together. So what they have really focused on is working with their school divisions, because they're also a local control state. Working with their school divisions to develop really clear, non-arbitrary policies around any provider coming into schools to support students. And those principals would take the lead on developing policies around who can come into this school building, because the principals are the lead on that. So every school division, every building should have a really clear policy. And so when we think about ultimately what is our goal with these guidelines, it is to work with every school to disseminate, get the information out there so that they can develop these really clear policies around collaboration and working together for the students and the families.
Yeah, okay. As a practical matter, if the children were receiving all the care they need in these settings, parents wouldn't be clamoring for a bill, as they are. And from parents and providers' testimony and previous committee meetings, as well as people who have reached out to my office, it seems fair to say that there are currently disparities in the ABA services that children are receiving in the public schools. Policies may vary from school building to school building within districts even. And if these guidelines remain optional for districts, won't there be disparity gaps across the state?
If I could, I know we talked a little, or we went on a little bit longer, but we did have a few extra slides. So to your point, if you could advance to slide 20, it does go through the differences, to your point of, is it discrimination? This is the process for students with disabilities. This is the process for students without disabilities. And then to your most previous question about, parents clamoring for something, I think districts have also been clamoring too, because like Rebecca said, they just don't know what they don't know. Mm-hmm. They don't know how BCBAs work, and with that clinical sense. So I think the guidelines having just come out this summer let districts have a chance to implement, to digest the information that they just received. Let us collaborate with MACE. We'll take the feedback that maybe the fanfare wasn't enough. Let us push this in to more districts in collaboration with our professional organizations. And if this is still an issue after the guidelines, then have another conversation of how can we best help our students and parents.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate you coming in. I appreciate all your careful analysis and the fact that we have all stayed beyond the time of the committee. And I appreciate everyone on the committee being so committed to thinking through this and to, we are weighing the futures of all these children across the state. And as we said before, this is unusual. We haven't done this as a state. The policy started in 2012, and we're all trying to figure out how best to help these students in a whole spectrum of situations. And we just want the best for each of them, and the best for each of them will be the best for their classroom as a whole, and the best for the school as a whole. And none of us is Solomon. So we really want to think this through carefully, and we appreciate your input. Representative Coons, you had a question.
Important. Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you all for being here today. We talked a lot about the guidelines, and I'm trying to understand, what are the barriers? 3 to 5 years seems like a long time. So what are the barriers? Why is it going to take so long? And if I can answer that for you, you already said you don't know what you don't know. I'm guilty. And then to follow up on that, how are we going to measure that? How are we going to know this is in 3 to 5 years we did the right thing? How are we going to measure this for educators and students? And I'm broadcasting this, whoever wants to take it. Nice. It's always safe to defer to the doctor. That's always,
Now,
well played.
when I say 3 to 5 years, I don't say nothing changes until 3 years, right? If you want to make like real systems change, where you've changed the way organizations work, it takes time to put things into place. So like, for example, if every school district in the state was going to put a policy in place, they have to develop the policy, they have to communicate the policy, they have to implement the policy, they're going to measure whether it's working. Like, that's not going to happen within a year. But each year, and maybe less, you're continuing to look at the progress. Part of behavior analysis is collecting data and looking at that data to make decisions. So as behavior analyst, that's what I would do, is I would continually look at the data. But to have true change that has broad impact across an entire state and every school system and every student and every family, like 3 to 5 years is actually pretty conservative. But I would hope we would be making changes along the way as we go, certainly.
just the scope of the project is the barrier.
The scope is huge, and we know this from other states, and having done this for a very long time, collaboration and coordination between systems is challenging.
Thank you.
Thank you. Representative Pavlo.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, ladies, for your testimony. My background is education. Part of the time, and I'm dating myself here, I was a Chapter 1 reading and math support teacher. Pull-out program, not very popular with my colleagues because I interrupted the classroom. Fast forward, I have an advisory board for education staffed with superintendents, teachers, and parents. And the topic at our last meeting that came up was the interruption to the other students in the classroom when outside services like ABA services are provided. What's your take on the impact on other students in the classroom?
That's a good point. That's one of the things we were going to talk about on a future slide is that, you know, if you, going back to that least restrictive environment piece, least restrictive environment is presumed to be the general education classroom. It's not always appropriate for every student, but that's where we start. So if services are being provided in a general education classroom, that is going to be disruptive, especially if you think about the one-to-one nature that it normally is in a clinical setting, is where does that happen in the classroom? And so it's that, or it's pulling a student out to provide that, right? So, I don't know. Do you want to add anything else?
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah, yeah.
Representative Paquette.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think maybe to drill into the problem, in my estimation, in the education world, there's kind of like, we're educators, we do this, and anyone outside, we kind of, in my estimation, there's a bias against any outside, which I think the bill tries to remedy to a degree. So on the guidelines on page 16, 17 here, and I get the mediation process, I like that, but when you look at the 504s and IEP teams, when they do decline, right, any other outside services, what does that look like? Why? Can you give examples as to why, you know, they decline outside services currently?
When you say they, do you mean the
The
school
IEP
district?
team or the 504 team?
Okay.
Why they have declined?
Yep, so depends if a district employs. There are many districts now, especially since that Medicaid expansion, that employ their own BCBAs. And those are BCBAs that are fully trained. Their specialty is school. So, and Amy could talk about it more, but usually when a BCBA is going through their preparation, their area that they get their like internship in becomes their specialty area, right? So a lot of schools now are employing BCBAs, and so if they have a BCBA, that could be one of the reasons that then they're going to have that person provide that.
Okay, so there might be a parent who doesn't prefer the ones in the school. They
There could
prefer,
be, yep.
and they'll be declined because of that
Not
issue in itself?
necessarily. I don't think that we could say that blanketly, that it would automatically be declined. I think that's something that the district needs to consider. And the parent is a member of the IEP team. So they have the right to ask for anything, consider anything, and the district is going to, or that IEP team is going to talk about it and, provide written notice as to why they refuse to do that or why they are going to do that.
Okay.
And the parent does have due process rights beyond that if they don't agree with that decision.
Okay, and is there a reason why the third party is a mediator and not an arbiter?
In the world of education, there is, the IDEA requires states to offer free mediation services. It's called Special Education Mediation Services, and they will provide at no cost to the parent or the district a mediation, or they can even provide IEP facilitation. Doesn't even need to get to mediation. They can request that a facilitator come in, they're neutral, and they would facilitate a conversation about that.
But that keeps it as the IEP team or the 504 team is the ultimate decision maker, no matter what. They're kind of the arbiter, right?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
Can I make a quick comment about, just kind of thinking about this systems issue? Families have private speech and language therapists, occupational therapists, physical therapists that they see outside of school, and they generally don't ask for those folks to come into the school environment to provide those services because there are speech, OT, PT within the school environment. Historically, there haven't been a lot of board-certified behavior analysts in schools. There wasn't a funding mechanism for them. So this is kind of a new process that there are actually BCBAs in schools so that is a service that is available there. And so when we think about the systems change, this is new. And so schools are just now getting BCBAs into schools, figuring out how to hire and fund them. So this, again, is part of the process of how do we provide these services in schools so that they don't need outside providers coming into the school environment.
Thank you. Yeah, Representative Boyce.
Thank you all so much for your testimony. This has been really helpful. I just wanted to kind of circle back to some of the earlier questions around the rollout. And I know there's a lot of information that goes out to districts. It's easy to miss things. Has there been any additional information that has been sent out since this was originally sent out to districts? Any training, anything like that you can speak to that may have helped facilitate getting this information out? And if not, is there any plans to do that in the future?
So I will say that I don't think it was as thorough as it could have been. There were a couple trainings that were provided in June, I believe. But if you think about summer and educators not working, if it went into an email, then it's at the bottom of their email when it came back to school. So usually the Department of Education will use the MACE, the Michigan Association of Administrators of Special Education Summer Institute in August to provide those things. So we did not provide a session on that. That is a session that needs to be MDE, MDHHS joint. And so we need to do better on that.
Thank you. And if I could ask just one more really quick, that's all right. The last point that you just made around that historically, there's outside speech, OT, PT services, and there's in-school. From a parent perspective, because I have children who have IEPs who have outside speech and then inside, there is the ability, or has been the ability, for those folks to communicate. And can you speak to why that's important and how this guideline helps facilitate that if you do, in fact, have an outside ABA therapist, but also have an in-school ABA therapist as well?
Yeah, I mean, I'll let you pass you. I think this is really giving some guidance around that collaboration. I think that has always been important, and we've always wanted to coordinate goals between any outside provider, whether it's a psychiatrist, a physical therapist, or whoever it is. I could tell you one of the barriers is with insurance, BCBAs cannot bill for time in, for example, IEP meetings and collaborating typically. So they do not get funded for collaborating. Which is one of the challenges that we can see, and that's a barrier. And I don't know that there's an easy way to get around that. But yeah, I'm hoping that the guidelines, with more education and intentionality around getting them out, that we will be able to work on that collaboration. Because yes, we should be coordinating goals because we were talking about generalization and having consistency. You don't want to have goals that are misaligned across providers.
And that certainly seems like that could be something legislatively that we could look at as well, around encouraging more of that collaboration to happen. And I will also say too that as my IEP team has been amazing in coordinating a lot of these things. But to your point, a lot of this communication was in writing because, again, like you can't necessarily get bill time in an IEP meeting, but you can send over reports and things that you're working on.
Thank you. Appreciate all the conversation and the thinking. We may have the people that the BAs, is it? Yeah, who are very familiar with the school setting, and then we may have the ABAs who are very familiar with the student as they come into the school. And so that's kind of part of what we have to think through in this whole decision process. So thank you so much for your conversation and your answering questions and presentation.
As a parting thought, I think mind shift and how do we do this is the first step in that systems change. And this document to try and get the two sides to understand each other's obligations and roles is the first step in that.
Yep. Thank you. So on the cards here, we have Stephen Donatelli from Acoyo Behavioral Health. He does not wish to speak and supports the bill. And Angela Cater, who does not wish to speak and supports the bill, representing herself. So thank you so much for all your presentations. So moving on, Vice Chair Linting moves, whoops. Oh, yes, thank you. Next, the committee will be taking up House Bill 5154, sponsored by Speaker Pro Tem Smit, which the committee heard testimony on last week. Hang on. Where'd my notes go? Right here. Rep. Wilson moves to adopt H1 substitute to House Bill 5154. The sub adds a tie bar. Would the clerk please call the roll?
Madam Chair, I have an amendment. I think I need to speak to it.
All right. Go ahead, sir.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Athletic events are undoubtedly an important part of the culture, not only for a school district, but oftentimes the communities themselves. And as legislators, one of the greatest responsibilities is to fight and defend the communities that we represent. To that end, I'd like to offer this amendment that would support many of these communities across the state. It would tie bar this legislation
Excuse me,
to
Representative
House.
Wilson, we have to stick to the bill, I guess.
Yes. This would tie bar the legislation to House Bill 4576, which is the supplemental the Senate passed yesterday, which would restore funding for critical projects and programs in the communities across the state.
I'm sorry,
This
sir, this
funding
is
would
out,
benefit
that's out
nearly
of order.
every
We
district
can't
in
do that
Michigan
right now.
and bring peace of mind and
Please.
clarity
Thank
who
you.
trusted the state and rely on these expected funds. So, Madam Chair, I move my amendment.
Okay, so I guess Representative Coons moves to adopt the H1 substitute. No? I still have to say him. Okay. Rep. Wilson moves to adopt H1 substitute to HB.
I move my amendment
54.
first.
So that sub adds the tie bar. So could the clerk please call the roll?
Chair DeBoer,
Pass.
Representatives Linting,
Pass.
Paquette,
Pass.
Fox,
Pass.
Coons,
Pass.
St. Germain,
Pass.
Pavlo,
Pass.
Wilson,
Yes.
Colzar,
Yes.
Weiss,
Yes.
Burns.
Yes.
Madam Chair, you have 4 yeas, 0 nays, 7 pass. The sub is not adopted.
Thank you. We do not have any cards to this. So Vice Chair Linting moves to report House Bill 5154 as substitute H1. So to the floor? No. Oh, I'm sorry. With recommendation, would the clerk please call the roll?
Chair DeBoer,
Yes.
Representatives Linting. Yes. Paquette,
Yes.
Fox,
Agreed.
Coons,
Yes.
St. Germain,
Yes.
Pavlo,
Yes.
Wilson,
No.
Colzar,
No.
Weiss,
No.
Burns.
No.
Madam Chair, you have 7 yeas, 4 nays, 0 pass. The motion prevails.
Thank you. There being no further business before the committee, the House Committee on Education and Workforce will stand adjourned.